From time immemorial, the sovereign nations have inhabited, protected, and preserved the land that is so-called Canada. We acknowledge this fact. The land we serve is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, and the Chippewa. Reelworld's offices are in Toronto, which is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit.
Good afternoon and welcome to the latest edition of our hashtag Her Frame Matters events. Today's panel is discussing the state of racialized women in Canadian media. My name is Samah Ali. I am a film programmer, podcast host, and formerly ran an organization called Sisterhood Media, where we distributed films on our platform, Sisterhood Media TV. I also have the pleasure of working with Reelworld on this research as the creative projects strategist. I'm so honored to be the moderator today, and for this brilliant discussion, we will reveal some of the ongoing research happening at Reelworld Foundation and talk to leaders in the field about how media representations affect our everyday lives. Now, this is a live discussion on YouTube, but it will also remain on Reelworld's YouTube page, where you can share with others after today. We have captions available for those interested in watching in French that you can find in the Settings tab. Today's panel will be 60 minutes in length with 45 minutes of discussion and roughly 10 minutes for audience questions at the end. If you're watching live, please put your questions in the chat box and we'll be sure to get to them at the end. Now, since we have a lot of ground to cover today, I want to get right into introducing the intelligent people on our proverbial stage. Debbie Owusu-Acha is the Executive Director at the Canadian Centre of Gender and Sexual Diversity, a youth-focused organization promoting diversity in gender identity, gender expression, and romantic and sexual orientation through education and advocacy. Karen Craig-Mill is the VP of Environment, Social, and Governance and former head of Anti-Racism, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Thought Exchange. Rona Karami is the research manager at Reelworld, focused on the power of digital storytelling and positive distribution of authority and voices. Sophia Abdegir is the industry programming manager at Reelworld, creating infrastructure to support Indigenous artists and artists of color through programming, presentation, and professional development initiatives. Finally, we have Tanya Williams. She is an award-winning actress and producer who has worked in the entertainment industry for the last 45 years, and of course is the founder and executive director of Reelworld. Thank you all so much for sharing your time with us today. And once again, thank you to those at home who are joining us and streaming on YouTube. Now let's get into this very juicy discussion. Tanya and Sophia, please share how hashtag Her Frame Matters came to life.
I'll start with, we'll start with just one, and then you can go to the other. This is, I think if you're a woman of color in particular, you have had to look at depictions of yourself, not always flattering, not that depictions always have to be flattering, but when they're constantly stereotypical to the point that just your life on the street, walking around, doing your everyday job, it's affected by what's on the screen. That's what people are seeing all the time, and they have these preconceived ideas about who you are because of these characters that they're identifying you with. And so I think part of my job as becoming an actress was to project characters that were not like these stereotypical roles. That was a key part of why I came into this business. And then later on, as you see the different auditions that come in for you and you realize this is just something that's constantly perpetuated, that there's no end to it. It's like the industry itself seems to want to constantly denigrate or really put out these images that are so negative at times, so stereotypical about what Black woman is, what a Latina woman is, what an Indigenous woman is. And I don't think they're understanding that there are real life consequences to these depictions. Then about almost 3 years ago, we did a brunch at Harborfront where we invited 100 women of color in the industry who were mostly executives and writers and directors, and to have a conversation not only about sexual harassment of women of color, but to also talk about the content that we're sometimes asked to write or direct or act in, and how challenging that was for us to sometimes work on things that we knew were not authentic in the way the characterizations were done. And from that, our staff kept having conversations about this, and then this wonderful grant, came up. And I'll take it over to you, Sophia, because she and our director of development, Emily Jane, had been talking and working, and then Sophia wrote this great grant.
Yeah, thank you, Tanya. And so for me, when I was looking at this grant, like Tanya mentioned, in 2018, there was this roundtable that occurred. One thing that happens is like we're always trying to reinvent the wheel. And so I consulted with Tanya and Emily Jane Williams to be like, what has Reelworld done? And seeing the history of that kind of helped to shape the direction to go with this grant. WAGE, which is the Women in Equity, Women in Gender Equities Canada, had this fund out for recovery for women because of COVID. I know when I was seeing the news, I was seeing the increase of violence, domestic violence, for women who were in homes because we were all secluded. And at the same time, we had this increase of watching because people were all inside. We also know within the industry, it was a setback for a lot of people. And we know whenever money is decreased, it always hits people of color. And then it also hits women of color. And then when you factor in other stuff like sexuality, gender, disability, that gets magnified. And so I was thinking through all this stuff. And then I saw a show that I was really enjoying. It was a Canadian show. And I was all right that it was a mostly white show and the Black characters they had were like decent. And then there was like one scene where there was a side character who basically was a vehicle for this there was a scene with a Black character, and this character was just a vehicle for this white character's realization. But she ended up having this very violent, traumatic experience, and it completely cut me off from the show. And I was really taken aback because it was using, the sexualized Black woman. She was a sex worker. And also the person who kicked her out of the home was like this Black woman, this angry Black woman. And I was just really taken aback by the fact that it was such obvious, at least to me, stereotypes, like archetypes. And so in writing this grant, I wanted to think through Canada's specific history with race and how that affects women of color and how that is created in the stories that we do. And so part of it is looking into the history, connecting these archetypes, whether it's like the old Indigenous, wise woman who just exists to like help the white character along the path. We see how this plays out with different races. And so we create this research proposal in order to investigate that, but also create a guideline so that there is a toolkit at the end, so that when creators, writers, executives are looking at projects that they want to option, projects that they're creating themselves, there is some checkpoints and things that they can be thinking through before they create these stories.
I love how there is something that people can actually apply to their everyday lives. And I think that's one of the most essential things of this research. Many times we have research come out, people read it, they call it a day. If you have something that you can continuously look forward to, almost like a checklist, like what you're describing as a guideline, that's something that can hold people accountable moving forward. I have to take it to Ronak, the research manager. Could you take us through your process about what this research explores?
Yes, of course. So this research explores how Black, Indigenous, and racialized women are depicted in Canadian film and TV series. It seeks to help increase authentic and or nuanced depictions of Black, Indigenous, and racialized women on a screen. So far, it has had 6 components that include a review of literature, one-on-one interviews with a number of CEOs, focus group discussions with performers and creatives who are Black, Indigenous, and racialized women, content analysis, which is analyzing the most watched Canadian films and TV series, and an audience-based study in collaboration with Ipsos, and a number of industry-wide surveys.
So great high level, but can you go more into detail about how each component adds together for this project?
Yes, of course. So the first step I took was conducting a review of literature. I studied reports, both academic and non-academic published sources, and online materials, of course, that discussed Black, Indigenous, and racialized women in both the Canadian and States screen-based industry. This component helped me understand the gaps in current studies and conversations about the depiction of Black, Indigenous, and racialized women in the Canadian screen-based industry, and was used as the base of our research plan. One of the most important things I learned and was consistent with a CMPA report from 2017 was that confronting the depiction issue in the screen industry is the toughest and largely unaddressed obstacle to creating authentic depictions. It is challenging to pinpoint and describe the nuances of people's identities and experiences within a few pages, and come up with suggestions for people who work in the industry to help increase authentic depictions. But as a team, we decided that we did not want this challenge to be an obstacle to addressing the change that is needed in the depictions. So we spoke to people with diverse backgrounds who work in different sections of the industry, including white people, in order to shape the protocol guideline. We captured the stereotypes that are carried through the work-related activities that contribute to the depiction of Black, Indigenous, and racialized women. And our final results will propose suggestions that will create meaningful and impactful change in different sections of the industry. Then after I finished writing the literature review, we decided to begin by learning about the process of green lighting and the components that affect this process. During March and April 2022, we conducted semi-structured one-on-one interviews with around 15 industry professionals who play a role in the decision-making process of green lighting content. The pool of interviewees hold positions at some of Canada's largest media companies, such as CTV and CBC. The results of the one-on-one interviews helped us understand that we need to conduct focus groups with racialized female individuals who hold key roles in the creation of content, such as performers, directors, writers, and producers. The focus groups explored the participants' experiences of working in the industry, the barriers and pathways to creating authentic stories and depictions, and suggestions to improve the depictions. Held during the summer of 2022, the focus groups were divided racially in order to create safer and braver spaces for our participants. The focus group discussions gave us intrinsic perspectives of those who are involved in the process of content creation that leads to depictions that an authentic an audience perceives. Since September 2022, we have been collaborating with Ipsos to conduct audience-based research, for which we recruited 8 participants in order to understand their experiences of watching parts of the most watched Canadian TV series. Currently, we are finishing the content analysis. For this component, we hired 7 students, the majority of whom study media studies at McMaster and York University, to code the most watched Canadian TV series and films. The content analysis gave us the extrinsic perspectives of the content from those who have no relationships with the depiction. We are also sharing a number of industry-wide surveys in order to reach to broader audiences and gather more insight from people who work in the industry. Besides the main components of our research, we had different panels and town halls in which we invited people who work in the industry to have conversations about their experiences of working in the industry. We also collaborated with the media department at McMaster University and brought academics to our conversations and discussed how the impacts of on-screen depictions of Black, Indigenous, and racialized women impact their lives. You can find online panels, of course, on our YouTube channel. You just have to search hashtag Her Frame Matters in the search box, and you will see our panels that are related to this project.
So just across the board, so much work, and I'm sure, Ronak, you are synthesizing so much data as well. Bravo to you, because this is a lot, and I'm sure it's emotional as well.
It is. It is.
Tanya, do you have anything to add? Oh, classic. Unmute.
Yeah, I've never used any kind of online process before. The mute button, of course. We learned a lot listening to what these women had to say. There were areas that had always been things I had thought about, but hearing other women say it made it a huge difference. We realized how important casting was. People don't talk about casting and agents and managers as the gatekeepers, but they really are very key. Producers and directors are only seeing who is presented in front of them, and that was an area we knew that we really needed to look at. And that's the next stage, actually, of our research is what are the changes? How can we shape things to make those challenges and those barriers sort of less? And how can we educate that entire sort of community, an area of our industry, to understand our communities better when they're thinking about casting? And when agents are thinking about, I'm thinking of one story right now. There was one agent who has an Indigenous client who's a woman. And even she said, it gets to the point, she said, where I was tired of people always asking for my client to do these just trauma work. Like every character was so heavy and so filled with trauma. It's like she felt like her client never got the opportunity to just be a woman in a scene, just, regular family, just doing regular things. It was like they were always specifically asking for our client to be a part of an Indigenous story where, rapes and just murders and crimes. And I think there's a part that it's exhausting right now, but as the Canadian industry tries to create more authentic voices, sometimes what they're doing is just escalating more trauma stories, and that's not necessarily the way we think might be the best for an audience who could get tired and eventually tone deaf to that kind of story.
Absolutely. Our stories are more than just the issues and trauma that we face on the everyday. We are multidimensional people. We should have multidimensional characters. Before I forget, I'm sure that the Reelworld team has had to consult many people outside of the organization because, let's talk about Ronak's work. It is definitely cut out for her. Is there anybody else that you onboarded, Tanya, to bring in more insights about this work?
Yeah, definitely. Dr. Patience Adamu, she's a PhD, and she actually is sort of a senior consultant to all of us. And her experience in community as a community researcher, and she's completed several research studies over the last decade that focuses on economic marginalization of Black people and immigrants of color in Canada. So she has been really a wonderful asset. She and Ronak work much more closely together, but once a week, all of us sort of meet together, and we're just blown away by a lot of the insights that she has found through the research that has been collected today.
and she's brilliant. I can say so myself. Let's keep going with the experts. I mean, we have Karen and Debbie here. I have to ask you two, you both have extensive experience on inclusion work regarding gender and race, of course. Could you speak more about the work both of you respectively have done around equity as it pertains to women of color and how it intersects with media? Debbie, let's start with you first.
Absolutely. And I wanted to start off by saying thank you so much for having me, and that patience is really awesome. I'm at patience in undergrad, and I'll talk a little bit about the undergrad experience kind of being my start addressing equity issues and looking at media. But I personally just love looking at how media works. For me, media is both a reflection of and a producer of culture. And at my organization, the CCGSD, our friends Media Smarts, who we've worked on with some of their work on digital literacy on LGBTQ issues, they say that media is created to represent reality and that it is also influenced by commercial considerations, which is two of the reasons why I find looking at media super interesting from an equity perspective. But to contextualize it for myself, I actually started doing this work engaging in like feminist dialogues. Been doing this for over a decade now, but I actually got started within the student movement. So kind of rooted with young people and really talking about feminist issues and equity issues from a critical perspective, but centering a Black feminist lens, which I think is super important to mention. And I did this when I was starting working at the Women's Center in my undergraduate student association. And now I continue doing that because I wear multiple hats with a like millennial twist, kind of considering this in our current digital age. And I also do so bringing my lived experience as someone who's a Black cisgender queer woman with roots in Ghana. So kind of looking to that first generation experience on top of things. At my organization, the CCGSD, we specifically use education as a means to address discrimination, but also build allyship for 2S LGBTQ youth, as well as adult allies in their lives. And of course, this is on top of promoting gender and sexual diversity in all of its forms. So my work at CCGSD, but also my own personal activism consultancy work, specifically looks at the ways in which media maintains power and inequity through both the creation of media texts, whether it's representation or stereotyping, but specifically looking at how ownership of media production operates and who owns it, who controls who gets casted, which was mentioned earlier, who gets paid. Looking at all of this because power is kind of central in all of it. And we're specifically unpacking the role media plays in intensifying the violence and vulnerability experienced by marginalized people. And for me, I specifically look at this for Black people, Black women and girls, queer and trans people. And, you know, right now, I try my best in the work that I do. It's some of the things I'm supporting my staff to give people and young people specifically the tools to look critically at media. But we're also taking this critical analysis of media and trying to inform policy change. It actually drives the conversations we've been having with decision makers around how media can play a role in addressing discrimination. But then we're also using it as a way to shift public opinion because ultimately our goal is to create long-term cultural change.
Wow, so much. You're doing so much work, and I love how you brought in media with it. Karen, what about your experience?
Well, I'll start by saying that I love that Debbie is so centered in this work and the connection that it has to the worlds that you're all in. I'm actually coming from a very different journey and perspective. So as a South Asian woman who grew up in East Africa and Kenya, my connection to film and media was very much around Bollywood and, you know, seeing depictions that were very stereotypical and harmful for women. And you can imagine as you're growing up trying to figure out who are you and how are you supposed to navigate the world. And it also felt very much out of reach because it's so dramatized. And so when I came to Canada and I started working on gender equality issues and diversity and inclusion issues and anti-racism. This is work I've been doing for over 2 decades globally across different sectors. You know, the pieces of work that I've done that connect to your world is number one, helping to raise awareness about real life issues and their connection to the stories that we tell and the things that we value in terms of what is entertainment, what is education, how is the media world understanding and navigating the power they have to not only change the narrative, but actually support social justice through the narratives that they tell. And then the second piece, which is also, I think, a very important piece, is I chose to move from being part of the audience and on the side watching what's happening in this world to saying, I want to be a part of it. I don't see myself in a lot of what I'm looking at on big screen and TV and radio. So I'm going to be the person that is on big screen, TV, radio as a model, etc. And so I've actually navigated the world as somebody who's tried to figure out, how do I become a model? What is the industry like? Where do I go to get an agent? And learning through that process of doing and going through casting, interviews, and all of that, learning the experiential barriers that women of color face in that process. And I have to say, I reached a point where I said, this is important work, and I'm also exhausted doing it as somebody who's just trying to show up on the screen, right? So I have a lot of respect for all of you in the work that you're doing. It's so important and so needed.
Thank you. We appreciate it. And we appreciate you being here, most importantly. I kind of want to stick on this topic of portrayals, how it impacts the everyday. And as Tanya had mentioned earlier, where we can get one-dimensional characters, aka negative depictions of racialized women on camera, how that affects our everyday lives, especially from, as Tanya mentioned again, casting, right? If we have one-dimensional characters and we're only getting casted in those opportunities, how does that affect women outside every day living their lives as audience members? Karen, I'll start with you.
Well, I think this is so important for us to talk about and to address in the industry because, if you're portraying, let's take Indigenous women, for example. We have a massive issue in Canada with missing and murdered Indigenous women and LGBTQI members of the Indigenous communities. And yet, when we look at the kinds of stories and films and the roles that Indigenous women and Indigenous people play, they do amplify the pain and the impact of colonization, but also the stereotypes of people who are, dealing with mental health issues, who are dealing with all kinds of social justice issues. And so it's really important that we tell those different stories because there's so much more to it. So I actually advise and work with upcoming women who want to be producers. In fact, I worked with a wonderful woman called Kimberly Veitch and advised her on how to connect and tell a different version, a different story. And she created the most powerful music video using Indigenous artists, Indigenous fashion designers, and Indigenous actors to tell the story of Indigenous women as being powerful, resilient, where their history and their community and their culture is a source of strength. And it was a completely different perspective that I think most people hadn't heard or seen. So, when we talk about the impacts, yes, trauma, re-traumatizing the audience, re-traumatizing the actors, re-traumatizing the people who are around when we're telling the same negative story over and over again. But I also think another part of it is that, from a real life impact, we're normalizing things that are not okay. So, if I think about a music video that I was a part of early on in my acting career, it was highly sexual, and it was very, given who I am today, I would have said, we need to have a conversation about what you're trying to portray here and why that should be the story that we're telling associated with the song that you're singing, right? So I think that's another thing is if we're not careful, we normalize harm and we normalize over-sexualization. And we lower the standard of what is considered healthy, what is considered entertainment. And I'll say one last thing. I think it's also important in the Canadian context that we consider when we talk about real life impacts on people, whose stories are we listening to? Whose voices are we hearing every day? And how is that impacting our idea of what it means to be Canadian? Because the Canadian narrative, as we've heard right in the introduction, should be a very diverse, rich one that reflects all of us. And that's not always coming through on what is funded and what we see and hear in those stories.
I love what you just mentioned at the end, and I have to reference Io's film, a filmmaker in Toronto who recognized that what we call multiculturalism is actually the hallmark of tolerance, and that is the title of their film. And if those who have not seen it, The Hallmark of Tolerance is a brilliant documentary film about some of the student movements in UFT, which I'm sure, Debbie, you are totally familiar with. So I'll throw to you as well. Let's talk about negative on-screen portrayals about women and the real-life consequences that it has.
Yes, thank you. And I know folks couldn't see, but I was snapping my fingers at the end of what you were saying, Karen, especially around which stories we end up hearing and how that informs our ideas of what is Canadianness. Because, I have so many things to share about that, and I'll delve in. But for me, I kind of wanted to start off kind of looking at something that really impacts the work that I do every day. Specifically as an advocate, but also someone who's leading this educational work with young to us LGBTQ people, but in particular, young, racialized, Black and Indigenous, queer and trans women. And it's specifically around, what we're seeing with the rise of anti-trans hate and how that's directly related to how the media continues to this day vilify gender diverse and transgender people. And this is having a significant impact on Black and brown trans women. In particular, the reason why we're seeing this is, and I try to explain this to folks when I talk about how hate manifests and how the media plays a role in it. There is a rise in visibility for transgender folks in media. And I think of folks like Laverne Cox, for example, who is a Black trans woman actress. She's American. We're seeing these depictions more, which we should be celebrating. But at the same time, there's still a significant level of misunderstanding of the actual real experiences of trans people. And we have bigots who are exploiting the middle. They're exploiting the rise of visibility and this misunderstanding. And that is at the consequence of the most marginalized people that I share community with. It's at the consequence of their lived experience, unfortunately. And we see this happen through print media, social media, television, and film, that there's still this need to stereotype trans and gender diverse people, which is causing a lot of harm. For Black trans women in particular, they're at the intersection of misogynoir, which is anti-Black misogyny, as well as trans misogyny. And if you're someone who has attended any Trans Day of Remembrance Vigil in Canada, we recognized this recently on the 20th of November. Take a look at the names and take a look at the photos of those women we've lost as a result of murder of trans women. A significant portion of them are Black, and a significant portion of them are also other racialized women. And this comes again because what we see in the media and these negative portrayals of marginalized people has real life consequences. And the media ends up being this place where all these interlocking systems of oppression meet. I also want to consider, and I think Karen mentioned this already, the flip side to this, where we see the rise in visibility and what it means in real life, with the consequences when we're actually absent from specifically Canadian media, and then the additional part where if we are presented, that those depictions of Black womanhood, for example, or other images of womanhood are coming from the United States. And so this is all being consumed by Black people. I remember being a young kid where my only images of Blackness and my understanding of Blackness as a Ghanaian Canadian was coming from the States. I watched a lot of BET. So I was understanding what it meant to be Black in North America, watching American television. But I think this goes back to, an ongoing part of the conversation on who is controlling the images that we see and the messages behind it. This level of erasure in media also results in the violence that we face when we're further marginalized. We either are told we don't exist, and that if we do, the images are caricatures that are constructed to market our identities, to essentially dehumanize us in many ways, which is problematic. And I think when we go back to the idea that Black women or other racialized women aren't seen in the Canadian side of media. It just means that there's that lack of diversity in our stories. And that's what's important if we're going to talk about media being that cultural producer of what it means to be Canadian. I kind of mentioned this earlier around the commercial considerations that media plays a role and how these things are intentional. It's not a consequence. People are profiting from these negative images that are depicting women of color, whether they're cisgender like myself or they're transgender like many of the folks I share community with. And if we don't address it, what we aren't also acknowledging is how that manifests even within our own communities. I would go further for people to consider conversations of colorism. Think about the ways in which dark-skinned Black women are presented on television in comparison to how light-skinned women are, and what message that tells us about gender, in the message that tells us around masculinity and femininity. And when we look at it from a decolonial perspective, none of these gender stereotypes about masculinity and femininity and hypermasculinizing dark-skinned women, for example, are to the benefit of Black people, because these gender norms that we were taught, that were forced upon us, serve whiteness. And that is something I think is important to mention. And one of the things we need to unravel when we talk about media and who's controlling these images. And so these have mental health impacts on us. I talk about my lived experience as a young person, trying to make sense of my Black identity, my gender, my queerness, but then also trying to parse that with how, even in my own community, people had stereotypes about me that impacted how I felt about myself. But then even now as an adult, it's impacting the people I love and I care about, because we're thinking about who we're losing as a result of the media playing a role in intensifying the violences that we experience. And so I'm obviously very passionate about this, but I do feel that it's not all doom and gloom. There's incredible work that's being done. I think this panel is a testament to it, that when we take back control of the images that are being depicted of racialized Black and Indigenous women, there's a power to it, because we're able to create those diverse stories and still speak to the negative things that our communities deal with. But then that's not central to the story. It's the diverse experiences and voices that are central, that Black and brown women just happen to be living. And I think that's key. It's that reclamation of power and being able to control the images.
You know, I was just thinking, Sama, when she was saying that Rosie Perez was being interviewed recently on NPR, and she said something. She goes, she's offered these roles that are stereotypical all the time, and she said, when I'm offered a role to be a prostitute, it's just the side, it's just a one-dimensional, it's a prostitute. But when your white counterparts, women, are offered roles to be prostitute, the whole movie, it's every dimension of that character being this prostitute and how she got there, and all the things that build up to it. So you get a real sense of the full character when it's a white character. When it's a Black character, she's just a prostitute. And there's these, it creates these nonstop images for people, so that when I walk into a room, I can feel it. And I think, and I'll speak to Black women in particular, you can feel all the preconceived ideas. You clearly were raised by a single mom. You couldn't have had a dad around, because that's what all the movies, and television shows tell you. You grew up in the projects. You had to grow up because all people are from the projects. And there's just all this stuff that, as people get to know you, you can hear them go, oh, you're not that. Oh, you're not this. So you don't get that privilege of what we call white privilege. You don't get that privilege where you're just a blank screen and people get to know you. It's like you walk in and they have all these, they know exactly who you are, and then you're unraveling that, which is it's just so much energy. One of the things that Debbie said too is about, colorism, and many of the actors we spoke to, the dark-skinned actors, one woman in particular, I remember her saying, in her 20 some odd years of being an actress, she has never had a kissing scene on camera. And that's, our industry defines everything as romance in the entertainment industry, television, film, whatever, it's all romance. And when you are never valued in that romantic, when you are never cast to be seen in that way. That is the industry constantly sending a message. Dark skin women are not beautiful in the way for a romantic comedy, for a romantic type of situation. These stories come up all the time. I'm thinking right now of even a white producer who wrote this really great movie, and she had the best friend of the main character. The main character's husband dies, and so the main character is dealing with this grief, and her next door neighbor, who ends up being a good friend, is a Black woman. And in the movie, this Black woman is comforting her and helping her. And I won't say who, but an exec had actually said to this white woman who'd written this screenplay, could she change that character into a white character, not a Black character? And because he did not feel that a Black woman would emote that kind of sensitivity around the subject. In his mind, those two things just did not go together. It made sense if it was a white character, but not if it was a Black character. And those are scary, because these people are making these decisions. The people that we talk about that are in power live in a world where sometimes the only people of color they meet are the ones they see on screen. So they already have the stereotypes of these people because those are the only people they know, are the people they've seen on screen, and then they continue to perpetuate it. So yeah, change does have to happen. And we hope this protocol guideline is a big part of it. I think producers do need that kind of guidance as to, well, what do we do? It's not going to be solved in one thing, because I can tell you that a lot of people of color are making stereotypical shows. They're making stereotypical content because we're forgetting, just because you're a person of color, you've been watching the same television for the last 20, 30, whatever years, this becomes normalized for you, and you are still making content for a white audience. Everyone is still making content for a white audience. How many times have all of us heard creators say they had an idea for something, but they actually start adding the stereotypes to it because they know they're pitching to white people who aren't going to understand the nuance of the other, what they're trying to say. So they actually start pitching stereotypes just to get their stuff greenlit. So I don't see, even if we start today making these changes, we need a whole generation. It'll be 20 years before they really understand how to create authentic stories and authentic characters.
And we need research like this to guide us.
Yes.
Ronak, I want to bring you back into this. Can you talk more about actors? We've really been talking about how audiences perceive things, but also there is that re-traumatization as an actor when you are dealing with negative stereotypes and tropes all the time. Was there any insights about how actors navigate conflicts or misunderstandings when it comes to depicting characters on screen?
Well, as you mentioned, Sama, earlier, our focus group discussions were sometimes emotional. And I feel privileged to sit with many experienced and brilliant women who work in the industry and learn about their experiences and insights. One of the things that I learned from our discussions with the participants and specifically the performers is that they're incredibly resilient. One of the ways through which the performers resist contributing to stereotypical depictions is by refusing to audition for roles that sexualize women or project race-based biases. Of course, I should mention that this has not been easy for many of the performers because their agents might not understand and or support them, or they might not have so many offers, so they go with the role because it's their job. I also learned that many of the performers try to open discussions about the authenticity of the characters with the production team. However, this has not, like in many cases, ended up losing their careers. I remember one of my participants said everyone has agency, but they have to choose when and where they saw an openness to having conversations and like practice it and use it. And I noticed that the performers use their agency when they saw an openness to having conversations. So I think it is important to have that space. Yeah.
I just recognize the time. And I have to let the audience know that we're shortly about to get to your questions. So if you've been thinking about something this whole time, please put it into the chat and we'll get to it probably in the next 5 minutes. So we're keen to hear what all of you have to say. And before that, I just want to bring it back to Sophia, because Sophia, you're on the ground and you are constantly talking to producers, actors, directors, and everybody in between. Are there any things that they have mentioned to you about navigating these conflicting ideas or scripts that they may not agree with that they have shared with Reelworld staff and at some of the events that you have hosted?
Yeah. So one of the good things is there has been a few industry changes regarding access. A lot of different broadcasters have been thinking about, authentic storytelling, questioning people about, why they're telling certain stories if they're not from those communities. But it will be a while before that content is out in the world. But one of the things that I do notice is I specifically run the producers program at Reelworld. I also do the programming, part of the programming team for the film festival. And one of the barriers is always finances. For folks who are trying to make things, you have to have a level of credibility in the industry in order to access it. But if you don't, it's like that catch-22. But if you're not able to make something, how can you then move forward? You also do have the fact that for producers in particular, that jump between working on smaller budgets and bigger budgets is where a lot of the friction happens, because broadcasters are not going to take that risk with you. And a lot of times you need to bring on a senior producer, but then the people who are senior producers are majority overwhelmingly white. And so you'll have people who have these ideas, they're brilliant, these things are great, and then you're bringing on a producer who might not have that same vision. And the thing with Reelworld is we are a place for people to come and speak to us. And so we've had people tell us, like, I'm loving this project, I'm moving forward with this, but the person that I'm paired with is undermining me, is actually creating a roadblock in order to get this done. And so I think we'd be opening up those channels and actually these companies and these broadcasters to really kind of take that risk. At one point, those white producers had someone take those risks as well on them. And so it would be that. There's also one thing I wanted to add was Tazeen Ahmed is our program manager for the protocol guideline, is behind the scenes and the person who, has been running all this together. So I just wanted to mention her.
Yes, absolutely. Shout out to Zine, running everything behind the scenes. Before we go to audience Q&A, let's bring it back to Ronak for some final words about the research. What happens now? I mean, you mentioned that there's an industry-wide component of this. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, at Reelworld, we are committed to the distribution of power and authority and voices, and we are accountable to speak with rather than speak to or speak for different communities. We also understand that in order to make impactful change, we must build knowledge collaboratively. The survey helps us learn about your insights and suggestions that help increase authentic stories and depictions in the Canadian media industry. You can find the information about the survey in the description box below, and the survey links are also available on our websites. I would appreciate if you answer the questions and share that with your communities. That would be great. Thank you.
Yes, we're going to be sharing all of these links in the chat, in the description box, on our website, in newsletters, Access Reelworld as well. Everywhere that you can find it, please fill it out, share it to fellow community members, because it is so essential for us to hear from everybody in the industry. Even those emerging, we want to hear from you too. Your experiences are most important to us. Now it's that important time where we're going to get to audience questions. So as I mentioned earlier, please put your question in the chat and we will get to it shortly. Now, first question, I'll read it out. Hopefully it is directed to a person. Let's get it on. Okay. I think one of the questions that we wanted to feature, which I'm going to go ahead, is there is a hunger for films and content that tells the true stories of many. The truth. Who holds the purse strings? Why do you think funding is so limited? Tanya, I'm going to throw this to you.
It's the interesting part about our research. There are so many departments that think the responsibility is another department. Everyone think producers think, that the funders have it. Funders say producers got more control. Writers think they have. Directors think, that somebody else. Writers think it's somebody else. At the end of the day, there's a real collective need to make change here. And one of the things that has come up in our suggestion through the protocol guideline too, is that even though there's a lot of focus on DEI people within companies, like, Rogers and CBC and Bellamy, all those, they have DEI people there, but that's mostly to make sure that within the company itself, there's a lot of diversity, which is important. There doesn't seem to be DEI people looking at the content that any of these companies are making. And I think that's sort of a very key thing that has to happen, that the content itself needs to be looked at by people who are from those communities, who can understand and say a yay or nay to these characters and to these depictions. This is going to be a hard change, though, for people who've been working in the industry and they've liked it the way it was, and it was great for them. All these changes that have been happening in the last few years in particular, there's going to be pushback because they have a system and it's set up, and change is hard for anybody, but this is change that is needed. And I think a lot of producers are actually unaware, and a lot of funders, I think they're really unaware of the impact that their stories and these characters are having just in the world on a daily basis. It's not a positive experience. You are creating the part of the problems. As some of our experts here have said, a lot of violence and oppression and sexual harassment of women of color come from these ideas that have been put out on screen. The screen industry is a powerful tool, and it can be used for good, but it can also be a tool that creates a lot of problems. And that's all I'll say on that one, because I sort of want everyone to get in on this.
Yeah, does anyone have anything else to add about purse strings? No? All right, well, we have... yes, Sophia.
Sometimes we see the exciting things on screen and we forget that, at the core of it is a bit of a conservative industry in terms of finance. And so there is a risk aversion for funders. And so, again, that kind of circle of going to people you trust because they've done it before, that I think is a very key issue, is being able to take the risk. And actually, I think allowing the space for things to work. One thing that I always worry about is, as things open up, there is always this immediate want of things to change right away. And I'm like, you can't put all the eggs in one basket. You have to allow space for some things to fail, because through that you also realize what needs to change, in the same way that young white men who were able to now be at the top were given that when they started out.
Absolutely, that is an essential point, Sophia. You need to give space for shows for them to come out, be successful, or come out and not be successful, and learn from that. Especially as racialized and Indigenous creators, it is essential for us to have the space to fail, so that way we are considered just like our peers, just like our white male peers. They fail all the time, but that doesn't mean that they lose funding. That doesn't mean that they lose relationships with people. Period, point blank. I want to get to our next question. How can we include casting directors to understand our fight? And how can we make them realize that the world has changed? I'm talking about the all-white casting directors who are often dinosaurs. Who wants to take this?
Wow, nobody wants to take that.
Well,
You
maybe
know,
maybe I can draw
oh yeah, go ahead, Karen.
maybe I can draw some parallels with the work that's done outside the industry, right? So we talk about allies and finding allies and building allyship, and I think part of how we can create change is to really think about the tone that we're using, and are we making people wrong and feeling like they don't want to be part of the conversation, or are we inviting them in and helping them see that maybe it's not an individual, but it's a lens to use that can help us ask better questions, be more conscious, learn from other best practices, etc. And so I think the opportunity to build allyship is you got to bring people together, but in a way that allows them to feel like they're part of the solution and not just part of the problem. So that would be something that I think is practical that we can do together.
We are working through this protocol guideline. We've been talking to casting directors, we've been talking to agents and managers, and I think what's hard for the people, on one side, maybe just actors, it's not all the casting directors. A lot of times they are, being told this is exactly what we're looking for, and so they're going and trying to find exactly what is. So this is what was wonderful about doing this. It's no one person, it's no one area that needs to change. It's an overhaul of the system that needs to change. Certainly creating, and I mean that's part of what we're doing at Reelworld too. We have a program called the Black Entrepreneur Program where we are training Black casting directors and Black agents and Black managers, which is something that hasn't really happened before. And I think that will shift also a little. But, casting is not an easy job, but you're not the end all. You don't have the last word. You don't get to control everything. But I liked what Karen said. I think it's not about blaming any part of the industry. It's about looking at the industry and seeing where can change happen. And that's where we like to live in the positive. We like to live in the positive parts of what we can do.
Wow. We have time for one more question. I know it's a packed panel, y'all. So let's get another one on screen. How difficult or easy would it be to name and shame these dinosaurs? I appreciate that jobs could be on the line, but anyone want to take this?
I think we kind of answered it before. I mean, we're not really looking to name or shame anybody. It's not the way we work at Reelworld. I mean, I know some organizations do, and I think it's a generational thing. I'm 64. It's just not the way. Martin Luther King didn't think it was the way either. There, at some point, we're going to have to take responsibility. We can control. I don't waste. The success I've had in my life has not been about changing other people's opinions. You can only imagine what was it like for me to start my career in the late 70s. I didn't have the energy to change people's minds. I had the energy to propel myself forward. And so with the protocol guideline and with the things we're talking about, it's about making the change going forward. I mean, dinosaurs they died automatically. I don't think anyone had to go out and kill dinosaurs. They'll just die. But there's a lot of casting directors out there that are, and agents that we spoke to, that are just as frustrated as some of the people that might be watching this right now. And they're pushing for this change in the same way. And I say, I want to partner with them and make the change. I don't waste any time with people who might be stuck way in the past and still want things the same. Some of us might have listened on the news this morning at the royal castle in England. I mean, somebody from the royal household said something to a guest and they are gone. This is not something that would have happened 20 years ago, but today they were gone in a minute. So that change is there. And what you call the dinosaurs, of which I'm one, we will eventually die out. And but I see that change happening in a very positive way. And I think all of the industry is looking to make that change. I think the question is they're trying to figure out how. You're really asking them to reinvent something that they have no concept of. So The industry really needs to attach itself to a lot of people like the people here on this panel, and to the work that so many organizations like Reelworld is doing across Canada, and take their advice. We know something about the communities we actually live in. We're women. We know. We know about ourselves.
Wow. Well, before I close everything off, I just want to give Ronak, Sophia, Karen, Debbie, do you have any last words that you would like to share with us? Everyone's good. Wow. Amazing. Well, it's been so good to be here, and this has been an extremely fruitful panel. I want to thank Karen and Debbie for sharing your expert perspectives with us today. And of course, thank you all at home for being here and participating in the live chat. As Ronak mentioned, this research involves everyone, so we want to hear from you at home. You can find the link to #HerFrameMatters survey in the live chat on our website. It's even on the screen right now. Look at that. Again, we want to hear from as many voices as possible, so share far and wide. And if you liked what you saw today, please hit the subscribe button and follow us at Reelworld Film on Twitter and at Reelworld on Instagram. Of course, don't forget to use the hashtag #HerFrameMatters. Thank you to the Reelworld team behind the scenes and in front of the camera for organizing this event and continuing their 22-year-long efforts to advance opportunities for Canadians who are Black, Indigenous, Asian, South Asian, and people of color in the screen industries. Reelworld Screen Institute is a not-for-profit that provides training programs and presents acclaimed opportunities as its core to Reelworld. Of course, there's Access Reelworld, and it is Canada's leading hiring platform for racialized crews and talent. Reelworld Foundation, a registered charity, is transforming the industry by creating mechanisms that hold systems accountable for greater equity, similar like this panel. Visit reelworld.ca to donate or learn more about our year-round industry programs. And be sure to sign up for Reelworld's monthly newsletter to stay up to date with all things that is happening at Reelworld. Once again, thank you, everyone. Have a lovely day.